And then the second text I wanted to point out is about the relation between the two labyrinths in the Theodicy. So he clearly draws that distinction, and you're suggesting that that there isn't that much of a connection between the two, and that's why they're not coming in. I just want to mention there is one point where he clearly thinks that the two are very tightly related, and if you were going to give a full and rigorous account, you'd have to get into the labyrinth of the continuum. So I'm thinking of some of the things he says in sections sort of 382 to 385 of the Theodicy. So it's in the context of a discussion of the doctrine of continual creation. So he sees Bayle and others as affirming this, and so this could potentially pose various problems for the Theodicy if God is continually creating finite substances at every instant. And he says, well, what would we have to do in order to provide a rigorous analysis to answer that question, whether conservation is continual creation? And he lists various things that we'd have to look into, different arguments for it, etc. And he also says in section 384, towards the end of that, he says, this dogma, he says, the difficulties of the composition of the continuum also enter into this matter. This dogma, continual creation, seems to resolve time into moment, while others regard moments and points as simple modalities of the continuum, that is to say, as extremities of the parts that one can assign to it, and not as constituent parts. This is not the place to enter into that labyrinth. So what's interesting there, I think he's saying that we'll look to give a rigorous analysis of whether conservation is continual creation. You have to go into the labyrinth of the continuum, but it's difficult. This isn't the context to go into that. So it's not that the two aren't related; they're very closely related. It's just that he doesn't think that this is the appropriate sort of forum to discuss it. So,
oh, that's an interesting. I must admit I hadn't noticed that passage in 384. Yeah, they are related, but at the same time, it's also significant, I think, that he says this is not the place for entering into the labyrinth, which is to say, he thinks that he does seem to think that the problems of the problem of evil, which is the central problem that he's concerned with, in this section, can be treated without resolving it. And he does at the very beginning, as I pointed out, set aside the problem of the labyrinth of the continuum. But, I don't want to say that there are no connections, whatsoever. But Leibniz certainly did think that we don't have to resolve it here in order to resolve the problem. Because if he did think that we had to resolve it in order to resolve the problem, then he would have, I think.
Could I just remind questioners to state their name for the benefit of the camera? Future frame. I think we have enough time to make it go.
All right. So, Mogens Lerken from University of Aberdeen.
Please speak into the mic too.
Yeah. Okay. I'm fairly sympathetic to this idea, so it's not so much an objection. I just wanted to draw your attention to the epitaph of the Theodicy. I think it's something that relates to what Jess said, that if you take a broader view of what monadology is about, then you get tighter connections. Now, the epitaph to the Theodicy is a quotation from Manilius' Astronomies, where it said something like this: why is it so surprising that men can know the world, since they have the world in themselves, and each one of them is in miniature an image of God. Now, this quotation sounds, of course, it sort of moves into the microcosmos, macrocosmos kind of discourse, but also sounds very monadological to me. This idea that the whole, it could seem as if from this quotation, if you put this as an epitaph, it would say that the whole sort of monadological idea of us being an image of God, that we have the whole world in us, is that sort of epistemological condition for at all performing this whole project. So, which leads me to what is the appropriate metaphor to use here. Actually, I was thinking about a text that Christian was quoting the other day about how Leibniz was thinking about how the world is in us and how we are in the how God is in us and how we are in God. And she's quoting a text where Leibniz speaks about us as being drops in the ocean. It's an old mystical metaphor you find in a lot of places, but there was a very nice quote you found out, and that made me think of, in this context, of what might be appropriate metaphor rather than the net or the starry firmaments, is the one that Leibniz actually employs himself quite often, namely the ocean of sciences. So he has this notion that all the sciences, and I think including also natural theology, physics, everything, is one big ocean that sort of flows together. So we should think about Leibniz not so much as an astronomer, as a navigator in the seas of sciences. So.
No, that's very nice. I mean, the quotation at the beginning of the Theodicy is very interesting. It doesn't relate, I think, specifically to the metaphysics of the monadology, but it certainly does bring in sort of larger metaphysical and epistemological considerations that do go well beyond the project of the problem of evil. Interesting. I'll have to think about that.
Nicholas Jolly, I'd like to cast the net a bit wider and ask for your views on a somewhat parallel case, that of the New Essays, a book which Leibniz didn't intend to for publication, which he didn't publish, but he did intend for publication. There, too, the monadology makes only very casual appearances, roughly parallel with the case of the Odyssey. There I would be not be inclined to say that Leibniz thought that the monadology was irrelevant to the debates of the New Essays, because Leibniz saw his debate with Locke in metaphysical terms, not epistemological terms, but as a clash of two metaphysics. So there you might have expected him to parade the theories of the monadology. I would be inclined there to emphasize that he was writing at the exoteric level, not the esoteric level. And I wonder whether you thought that the two, or how far a parallel story could be told for the two works regarding the relative silence about the monadology. As regards systematicity, I tend to think that some commentators are arguing past each other, and what is needed is a definition of what makes a systematic thinker. But that's by the way. I'd just be interested in your views on the somewhat parallel case of the New Essay.
Yeah. Let me say something about the systematicity first, and then talk a little bit about the Nouveaux Essais. On the systematicity, what's striking in the case of Descartes is you cannot do the physics until you do the metaphysics. That the results of the metaphysics actually contribute in very substantive ways to the content of the physics. So you have the domains that are directly connected with one another. That's the structure also, the apparent structure at least, of the ethics. You have to do part one of the ethics before you can do part two before you can do part three, and so on and so forth. And I think Leibniz his structure is, that's what I mean by a sort of strongly systematic philosophy. And I think Leibniz is just not like that. Not that there aren't any connections between the different parts, but I think that the connections are somewhat looser. As far as the Nouveaux Essais, I haven't actually looked through the Nouveaux Essais for discussions of the metaphysics. So I'm not sure, but I do believe that, you're probably right, that this was intended as an exoteric rather than an esoteric work, and that he was hoping to get into a public dialogue, obviously, with Locke. And that's why it is that he wrote it, and he certainly does want to bring in some of his metaphysical questions. I think that, as your book from years ago showed, that the real issue there has to do with the mind and body and materialism stuff. That's underneath. But it's also, I think, a mistake to overestimate how much detail Leibniz had actually worked out on, say, the metaphysical stuff as of, say, 1704, when he was composing or finishing up the Nouveaux Essais.
And writing to De Volder some of the most famous statements, most quotable statements of the theory of monads around the same time.
Absolutely. But the thing to remember is you read those statements, read them in the context of the larger letters in which he's writing them. They come out as paragraphs or a couple of paragraphs. He's not putting it together into a systematic whole story. And he does that in the Système Nouveau, which is, I think, a crucial work from 1695, where he's pulling stuff together. I mean, he does that to a certain extent in the I think the key documents are the letters with Arnaud, which is a sustained discussion but not really organized into a treatise. You have the Système Nouveau of 1695, where he's pulling together and trying to get a kind of systematic statement of certain of his metaphysical views and how it is that they go together. The next systematic view that you get is 1714. He's developing these things in letters, but not in a kind of organized way. And I think that even while he's writing the Nouveaux Essais, he doesn't really have it all pulled together in his mind. And the next time that he does it will be in 1714, when Ramond and Eugène are pressing him for, more rounded, systematic development of his view. And that's when you get, these really, really interesting documents. But even then, I think they're not. He didn't regard them as really finished.
Don Rutherford, UC San Diego. There's a bit of a moving target that I'm responding to here, because I thought at the beginning that there was a very radical position that you're defending, that he was a sort of non-systematic philosopher, and there was no connection whatsoever between the monadology and the theodicy. And I was just going to say, yeah, Jeff's right. But you offered a lot of concessions, I think, to what Jeff was saying. Leibniz is somewhat systematic. There are connections between a lot of things. The monadology actually contains a lot more than just the doctrine of monads.
The text, the monadology.
Yeah, and I think,
yeah.
but then it's just an arbitrary label, monadology, the project. If it's just the first 10 sections of the monadology, I mean, it's that particular doctrine of substance. But that's just your label. So what I'm hearing now, though, is a kind of what seems to me a kind of conflation or confusion between what Leibniz actually accomplished versus Descartes or Spinoza in terms of what works did he produce, versus, on the other hand, his conception of philosophical methodology, or his conception of what a philosophical system would be. And you're sort of going back and forth between those two things. Yes, Leibniz did not accomplish an ethics. He did not accomplish a principles of philosophy. There remained sort of unclarity or perhaps uncertainty in his mind about where things would ultimately end up. The monadology is about as good as he got at the end in terms of giving a complete presentation of his philosophy. But that doesn't seem to me to really speak to the point, what was Leibniz's conception of philosophy? How did things hang together for him in an ultimate sense? Did they hang together in ultimate sense? Well, I think we've got two sort of things that I would point to here, and I'm sure others will have other things to say. The first is if we look at the monadology itself, the work, the complete work, it's not just the first 10 sections on the theory of substance. It goes to lay out this entire picture of the created world and then ends in section, 80 or 90, with essentially a précis